Sanctions against Russia, the Republican Rebellion, shaking Washington to its core. There are moments in history where politicians must choose a side, not their party's side, not their president's side, but the side of history itself. And right now, deep inside the United States Capitol, a handful of Republicans are making exactly that choice, a choice that could change everything for Ukraine, and one that exposes a fracture so deep, so explosive, it cuts through the very heart of Donald Trump's own party. What you're about to hear is not just another political squabble. This is the story of men staring directly at what others refuse to see. This is the story of a silent rebellion that has been building for months in the corridors of American power. And above all, this is the story of a question that concerns every single one of us. Is the Western world repeating the most catastrophic mistakes of the 20th century? Buckle up, because this story goes far deeper than anything the mainstream media is showing you. Let's start by understanding what is actually happening. Since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the world has had its eyes locked on the battlefields, the drones, the missiles, the cities reduced to rubble. But while all of that was happening, in the carpeted offices of the United States Congress, another war was being fought in silence, a bureaucratic war, a procedural war, a war of influence. And that war may be just as decisive for Ukraine's future as anything happening on the ground. Republican Representative Don Bacon, elected from Nebraska, has decided he is done staying quiet. And when a Republican publicly says that his own president is failing on one of the most critical foreign policy issues of our time, trust me, that does not go unnoticed. That is not a slip of the tongue. That is not a diplomatic accident. That is a declaration of political war. Bacon, alongside his colleague Brian Fitzpatrick, is preparing something that Washington has almost never seen, a discharge petition filed against the will of their own Republican leadership. For those unfamiliar with American legislative procedure, let me explain exactly why this is so extraordinary. A discharge petition is the nuclear weapon of the minority lawmaker. It is the mechanism that allows a majority of House members to force a vote on legislation even when congressional leaders refuse to bring it to the floor, even if Speaker Mike Johnson does everything in his power to block the process, even if Donald Trump himself would prefer this vote never happens. For this motion to succeed, it needs 218 signatures, 218 members of Congress who publicly agree to say, "We are going over the heads of our own party." Historically, this almost never happens, because signing a discharge petition against your own party means turning your back on your colleagues, your leadership, and potentially the President of the United States himself. It means risking your political career. It means risking a primary challenge. It means risking everything you have spent years building. And yet Bacon and Fitzpatrick are prepared to do it. Why? Because they believe something far greater is at stake. To understand their logic, you need to listen very carefully to the words Don Bacon chose. It is not an accident that he invoked Winston Churchill and Neville Chamberlain. It is not an accident that he referenced the Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia, and the appeasement that preceded the bloodiest war in human history. These historical references are not rhetorical exaggerations. For Bacon, they represent a deep, visceral conviction. Let us revisit the historical facts he is citing. In 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain sat down with Adolf Hitler and negotiated the Munich Agreement. The logic was disarmingly simple. Give Hitler what he was demanding, the Sudetenland, a German-speaking region of Czechoslovakia, and buy peace. Chamberlain flew back to London waving a piece of paper, famously declaring he had achieved peace for our time. History judged that moment as one of the most catastrophic diplomatic failures ever recorded, because 1 year later, Hitler invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia. The following year, he invaded Poland, and the world was plunged into a war that killed over 70 million people. Bacon sees a direct and deeply troubling parallel with today. Putin is demanding certain Ukrainian territories. Putin claims his ambitions are limited. Putin promises that if he gets what he wants, peace will follow, and a portion of Washington seems tempted to believe him. For Bacon, this is the Chamberlain scenario playing out in real time, and he refuses to be part of it. "You have to recognize evil when you see it," he said. Simple words, direct words, words that cut through the usual fog of diplomatic language like a blade. and those words carry even more weight because they come from a Republican, from a member of the party that supports Donald Trump, from a man who under any other circumstances would be the last person to publicly challenge his own president. But now let us talk about Donald Trump, because this is where the story becomes genuinely complex. Since returning to the White House, Trump has made a spectacular pivot in his foreign policy toward Russia. The administration has imposed sanctions on certain Russian entities, targeting primarily the oil and gas sector. But according to Bacon and a growing number of observers, these sanctions are nowhere near sufficient. They do not hit hard enough. They do not meaningfully cripple Russia's war machine. Even more troubling is what has happened to direct military aid for Ukraine. Bacon states it bluntly and without hesitation. Under Trump, aid to Ukraine represents barely 1% of what was being provided under Biden. 1%. Stop and think about that number for a moment. While Ukrainians die every single day on the battlefield, while entire cities are being turned to ash, while hundreds of thousands of civilians flee their homes, American assistance has fallen to a level that is, in practical terms, symbolic. And Trump himself? He called Iran a tough negotiator, showed openness to dialogue with Tehran, and at the same time appears increasingly reluctant to maintain maximum pressure on Moscow. Peace negotiations have stalled completely. The deadlines he himself set for Ukraine have created deep divisions on Capitol Hill, and meanwhile, the war continues without pause. Don Bacon did not hold back when comparing Biden and Trump on this issue, and his conclusions are harsh for both. Biden, he says, sent aid, but always too late, always with too many restrictions, always leaving Ukraine to fight with one hand tied behind its back. But Trump, in his view, has done even worse, because at least Biden had a clear position in favor of Ukraine. Trump, on the other hand, seems to be navigating blind, oscillating between aggressive posturing and signals of rapprochement with Putin that leave Kiev in a state of complete and devastating uncertainty. Now let us go inside the legislative deadlock, because this is where things become almost surreal, revealing a political system that is profoundly dangerously broken. Brian Fitzpatrick introduced his sanctions bill in December. The concept is simple yet powerful. If Russia refuses to genuinely negotiate a peace agreement with Ukraine, or if it violates any peace deal that might be reached, massive sanctions would be automatically triggered. This is not a declaration of war. This is not a military commitment. This is simply telling Putin, the economic cost will be real and immediate if you persist in your aggression. This bill has bipartisan support. Republicans and Democrats are ready to vote for it. Fitzpatrick spent months carefully constructing this cross-party coalition, and yet the bill is blocked, has been blocked for months, stuck in a Kafkaesque procedural no-man's land that defies all logic. Here is why. Speaker Mike Johnson says he supports sanctions in principle, but insists the process must begin in the Senate. Senate Majority Leader John Thune says exactly the opposite. The process must begin in the House. The result? The bill begins nowhere. It goes in circles, it waits. And while it waits, Ukrainians die. This is what Bacon calls, with unmistakable frustration, giving leadership one last chance to organize a proper vote, one last chance before the discharge petition is filed, one last chance before this becomes an open declaration of rebellion against Republican leadership and implicitly against the White House itself. We need to pause here and consider what this situation means for American democracy itself, because what we are witnessing is a system of checks and balances being pushed to its absolute limits. Congress is supposed to be a counterweight to the executive branch. It is supposed to be capable of acting independently on the great questions of foreign policy. This is written into the American Constitution itself. Congress has the power to declare war. Congress has the power to impose sanctions. These are not decisions that belong solely to the president, and yet for years, Congress has progressively surrendered its foreign policy prerogatives. Presidents have accumulated more and more executive power, and now even members of the majority party hesitate to use their own constitutional tools, not because they disagree with the policy, but because they fear displeasing the president. The discharge petition being prepared by Bacon and Fitzpatrick is therefore not only a debate about Ukraine, it is a debate about the very nature of legislative power in the United States. It is a question of whether Congress is still capable of acting independently when the stakes are high enough. And if 218 members of Congress cannot agree on something as fundamental as sanctions against a power that has invaded a sovereign nation in broad daylight, What exactly remains of the American legislative branch? Now let us look at the numbers, because the numbers tell their own story. For the discharge petition on Fitzpatrick's sanctions bill, 218 signatures are needed. According to the latest information, Bacon and Fitzpatrick are far from that threshold. They are starting from scratch with this new procedure. It is a mountain to climb. But there is another measure in play, one introduced by Democratic Representative Gregory Meeks of New York, aimed at increasing aid to Ukraine. This measure is missing just one Republican signature to reach 218, just one. And Bacon says there is one undecided Republican thinking it over, and another who wants to wait until after his primary is over. That last detail is devastating in what it reveals, waiting until after the primary. This Republican is willing to support aid to Ukraine, but not right now, not before he is safely reelected, not before he has survived any potential challenge from a pro-Trump candidate in his own district. That cold, cynical political calculation, made while people are dying, captures the state of American politics in 2026 more honestly than any analysis ever could. Bacon does not wait. Ukrainians are dying every day, he says. For him, this is an absolute moral reality. You cannot wait a month or two when human lives are on the line every single hour. But who is Don Bacon, really? And why does his voice carry so much weight in this debate? Bacon is not an ordinary Republican politician. He is a veteran of the United States Air Force who served for 30 years. He commanded military bases. He understands military strategy from the inside out. And when he says the West is making a historic mistake, he is not speaking as a politician who read some history books over the weekend. He is speaking as someone who has spent his entire adult life thinking about national security, about real threats, about the concrete consequences of political decisions made in comfortable offices far from the battlefield. His assessment of Putin is unambiguous and unsparing. Putin has made clear that his ambitions extend well beyond Ukraine. Putin wants to reclaim what he considers the territorial legacy of the Soviet Union. For Bacon, this is not a theory. It is not speculation or extrapolation. It is what Putin has said himself, in his speeches, in his published writings, in his actions over more than 2 decades in power, and the record is long and consistent. Georgia in 2008, Crimea in 2014, the Donbass from 2014 onward, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Each time, the Western world hesitated, negotiated, and ultimately accommodated. Each time, Putin interpreted that hesitation as a green light to go further. Each concession was read not as goodwill, but as weakness. Now let us talk about Fitzpatrick, the other central figure in this story. Brian Fitzpatrick represents a Pennsylvania district that is one of the most competitive in the entire country. He has been reelected multiple times in a district that swings both ways. He is precisely the kind of Republican, moderate, pragmatic, guided by principles rather than party directives, who is most valuable and most rare in the current American political landscape. Fitzpatrick is in direct contact with the White House about this vote. That fact alone tells you something important. It means Trump is aware of what is being prepared. It means the pressure is building on the administration. And it means the White House will eventually have to take a clear and public position. Either Trump actively supports the sanctions and gives the green light for a vote, which would be a significant pivot from his current posture, or he opposes them and publicly accepts responsibility for blocking a bipartisan measure supported by members of his own party in Congress. Both options carry enormous political costs, and that is precisely the uncomfortable position Bacon and Fitzpatrick are working to create. They are forcing a choice. They are making the implicit explicit. They are ensuring that no one can hide behind procedural ambiguity any longer. Let us now think about what all of this means for the future of Ukraine, because ultimately that is the central stakes of this entire story. Ukraine is a country of 40 million people fighting for its survival, a country whose soldiers die every single day defending not only their own territory, but the principles of an international order built on rules that the entire world agreed to after the most devastating conflict in human history. The principle that a sovereign nation cannot simply be invaded by a more powerful neighbor. The principle that internationally recognized borders are inviolable. the principle that brute force cannot be allowed to override the rule of law. If the West allows Putin to prevail in Ukraine, or even allows him to consolidate significant territorial gains without paying a real and lasting price, the message sent to every other authoritarian regime on the planet will be catastrophic. China, which is watching Taiwan with calculating patience, Iran, which monitors its neighbors and tests boundaries wherever it finds them, North Korea, which continues developing its nuclear capabilities with growing confidence. Every one of these regimes is watching what happens in Ukraine as a direct test of Western resolve, and if that test reveals that the West prefers short-term comfort over long-term security, if that test shows that sanctions can be blocked indefinitely by procedural squabbling, if that test demonstrates that even an openly aggressive power can act without real economic consequences, then the world of 2030 will be a dramatically more dangerous place than the world we inhabit today. Let us come back to Washington. The coming days will be decisive. Bacon has said he will sign the discharge petition the moment Fitzpatrick's bill becomes eligible. The question is whether 217 other members of Congress will find the courage to do the same. Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut, the Democrat coordinating sanctions efforts in the Senate, has publicly stated that Congress is still waiting for a signal from Trump. That is an extraordinary admission. Congress, and the branch of government specifically designed to act as a check on executive power, is waiting for the president's permission to exercise its own constitutional authority. That is the degree of deference, some would say submission, that the American legislative branch has developed toward the executive. But perhaps Bacon and Fitzpatrick are changing something fundamental. Perhaps their rebellion, even if it fails to gather all 218 signatures needed for the discharge petition, creates enough political pressure to force Johnson and Thune out of their procedural paralysis. Perhaps the simple act of publicly naming the failure, of saying out loud in plain language that the president is failing on this issue, breaks something in the wall of Republican silence. Because silence, in moments like these, is not neutral. Silence is a choice, and that choice has consequences that extend far beyond any single election cycle. History has a cruel way of judging those who choose the comfort of inaction in the face of crises that demand an immediate response. Bacon said it himself. In the history books, the names of the Churchills and the Chamberlains will be recorded for eternity. The former for having had the courage to look reality in the face and act decisively when acting was hard. The latter for having preferred the illusion of peace over the reality of the threat standing directly in front of them. We are at a turning point. The decisions made in the coming weeks in Washington will have consequences that echo for decades. Will the United States Congress find the courage to vote for real sanctions against Russia, independent of political calculations and primary fears? Will Donald Trump choose to stand behind a Ukraine that is fighting for its very existence, or will he continue to navigate in strategic ambiguity while Kiev burns? Will the Western democracies learn the lessons of history, or will they repeat the errors of the 1930s with the full knowledge of what those errors cost the world? Bacon has chosen his side. Fitzpatrick has chosen his side. Now it is up to the other 216, and while they decide, Ukrainians die every day, without exception, without pause, without anyone asking their permission to wait. History is being written right now, and it will look back at every single one of us. If this story reached you, if you believe that these stakes deserve to be understood beyond the shallow surface of daily headlines, then you know what to do. Subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, because truly, understanding the world we live in, with all of its contradictions, its dangers, and its moral weight, is the first and most powerful act of resistance against indifference, against disinformation, and against forgetting what it cost humanity the last time we looked away.